I'd been retired for 3 years when the doorbell rang on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was in the garage, reorganizing my fishing gear for the last trip of the season before the lake froze over. My knees weren't what they used to be, and kneeling on the concrete floor reminded me of that every few minutes. 64 years old, 2 artificial hips, and still too stubborn to ask for help. My wife Margaret used to say that about me before she passed. 7 years ago now. Some mornings it still felt like last week. I wiped my hands on a rag and walked to the front door. My son stood on the porch. Franklin, 31 years old. His mother's eyes. My jaw. He was holding a coffee from Tim Hortons, which meant he hadn't come from home. He'd been driving around, working up to something. He only bought coffee when he needed to think. "Dad," he said. "Come in," I said. He sat at the kitchen table and didn't touch the coffee for a long time. I made myself a cup of instant and waited. Franklin had never been good at starting difficult conversations. His mother had been the same way. She'd circle around something for 20 minutes before landing on it. I used to find it frustrating. Now I just missed it. "Diane wants to move the wedding up," he finally said. "To March?" The original date had been September. That was only 5 months away now. "Why March?" I asked. He shrugged. "She says she doesn't want a long engagement. She wants to start our life." I looked at my son's face. He was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that was working hard. I'd spent 30 years as a site supervisor for a general contracting company outside of London, Ontario. I'd learned to read the faces of men who were trying to convince themselves of something. I told him that sounded fine. I told him I was happy for him. After he left, I stood at the kitchen window for a long time and watched the neighbor's dog chase something across the yard. Franklin had been with Diane Ashworth for 14 months. He'd met her at a conference in Toronto. He worked in commercial real estate, and she did something in financial consulting. She was 34, polished, smart, the kind of woman who always seemed to be slightly ahead of whatever conversation she was in. When I'd first met her at Thanksgiving, she'd been perfectly pleasant. She'd complimented the house, asked thoughtful questions, helped clear the table without being asked. I hadn't trusted her then. I couldn't have told you why. That's the thing about instinct. It doesn't come with an explanation. A week after Franklin's visit, I drove into London to meet my old friend Roger for lunch at a diner on Dundas Street we'd been going to since the 90s. Roger had retired from the London Police Service 2 years before me, and he spent most of his time now spoiling his grandchildren and complaining about property taxes. We'd known each other for 30 years. He was the kind of man you could say anything to. I told him about the wedding being moved up. I told him about the feeling I couldn't shake. He didn't dismiss it. Roger had spent 22 years in financial crimes before he retired, and he had a habit of taking uneasy feelings seriously. "What do you know about her background?" he asked. "Not much," I admitted. She grew up in Mississauga, I think. Went to Western, works at a firm in downtown Toronto. And Franklin's situation? This was the part that mattered. Franklin had done well for himself. He'd inherited the house in Byron from his mother's side. It was worth somewhere around $900,000 now, maybe more. He had an RRSP, a solid income, and he was the primary beneficiary of my own estate, which included the property in Lambeth, my pension, and savings I'd spent 40 years building. It wasn't generational wealth by anyone's grand definition, but it was substantial, enough to matter. Roger stirred his coffee. "You ever look her up properly?" "No," I said. "You want me to make a call?" I thought about Franklin's smile on the porch, the coffee he'd bought to give himself courage. "Yeah," I said. "I think I do." It took Roger 9 days. He called me on a Thursday evening and asked me to come to his house rather than talk over the phone. I drove over after dinner. His wife made tea and then politely disappeared upstairs. Roger set a folder on the coffee table. Diane Ashworth had a previous marriage. She had been married for 2 years to a man named Gerald Kowalski in Hamilton. He was a semi-retired contractor who had inherited a commercial property from his father. The marriage ended in divorce 18 months in, and there had been a legal dispute over the property that had gone on for nearly a year afterward. Gerald had kept the property, but only because his original deed had been structured in a way that made it difficult to contest. His lawyer had been aggressive. Diane's lawyer had pushed hard. There was more. Before Gerald, there had been a man named Stuart in Ottawa. They had never married, but they had lived together for almost 2 years. Stuart had been a civil servant with a federal pension and owned a condo in Centertown. When the relationship ended, there had been a dispute over furnishings, renovations she claimed to have funded, and a personal loan she said he owed her. Stuart had paid something to make it go away. Roger looked at me across the table. "It's a pattern," he said simply. I drove home and sat in the kitchen in the dark for a long time. I want to be careful here about what I felt. It wasn't satisfaction at being right. It was something heavier than that. Because the moment I sat down with Roger's folder, I understood that the problem wasn't Diane Ashworth. The problem was what I was going to do about it, and how I was going to do it in a way that didn't destroy my relationship with my son in the process. Franklin was in love, and Franklin, for all his competence and intelligence, had his mother's fatal flaw. He trusted completely, and he trusted fast. Margaret had trusted me inside of 3 weeks. I had spent 40 years trying to be worthy of it. I still wasn't sure I had succeeded. I called a lawyer the following Monday. Her name was Patricia Holt, and a colleague from my old job had used her for an estate matter a few years back and spoken highly of her. Her office was in a Victorian house on Richmond Street that had been converted to professional space, and she was the kind of lawyer who listened more than she talked, which I appreciated. I laid out everything: Roger's information, my concerns, the timeline of the accelerated wedding. I asked her what I should be doing. She spoke carefully. She said that before anything else, I needed to update my own will and ensure my estate documents were airtight. She said that whatever happened between Franklin and Diane, my assets were my first responsibility to protect. She said that under Ontario law, a spouse could make claims against an estate in ways that a non-married partner could not, and that if the marriage proceeded, certain protections needed to be in place. We spent 2 hours going through everything. By the time I left, I had agreed to come back the following week to sign updated documents. She also said something else, almost offhand, as I was putting on my coat. She said that if I ever came across any conversations or communications that were relevant to a legal matter, I should be aware of what could and could not be used. In Ontario, private communications are protected, and recording someone without their knowledge is a serious matter. She wasn't advising me to do anything improper. She was simply making sure I understood the landscape. I nodded and said I understood. December came. The wedding preparations accelerated. Diane had chosen a venue in Port Stanley, a converted heritage building near the water. The reception hall held 200 guests. The package, Franklin told me over the phone, was somewhere in the range of $40,000. He said it casually, the way people do when they're trying to not make something sound like what it is. I asked him how he was handling the cost. He said Diane had suggested they take a joint personal line of credit to cover it. They hadn't combined finances yet. They were planning to do that after the wedding, but she had said it made more sense to manage the wedding expenses together. I said that sounded like a significant commitment before the marriage was formalized. Franklin said I was being old-fashioned. I didn't push it. I had learned over many years that pushing a man toward a conclusion he isn't ready for only makes him dig in. You have to let a person arrive at things. In January, I drove to Toronto to visit Franklin at his condo. Diane was working late, she often was. We had dinner at a place near his building and talked about hockey and the price of heating oil and his mother, the way we sometimes did in the winter when the anniversaries stacked up. It was a good evening. On my way out, I used the washroom. On the counter near the sink there was Diane's phone, face up, charging. A message had come in while I was washing my hands. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't touch it. I read what was visible on the screen from where I stood. It was from a contact saved only as initials. The message said, "Still on track? Timeline good?" I stood there for a moment. Then I dried my hands and walked out. I called Roger from the parking garage. He was quiet for a moment after I told him. Then he said, "You need to be very careful now, Gordon." My name is Gordon, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that. Roger connected me with a man he knew from his time in financial crimes, a private investigator named Desmond, who worked out of an office in Kitchener. Desmond was methodical and thorough, and charged accordingly. I paid him from a personal account I'd never mentioned to Franklin. Desmond spent 6 weeks on it. What he found was this. Diane had a third connection I hadn't known about. A man in Calgary, 5 years earlier, a widower with a significant investment portfolio who had been in a relationship with her for almost a year before abruptly ending it. He had refused to speak on record. But there were court filings, referenced in an obscure civil proceeding, that painted a clear picture of a dispute over financial documents she had allegedly encouraged him to alter. Nothing had been proven, nothing had gone to trial, but the shape of it was unmistakable. Desmond had also documented something more current. Diane had a friend, not a close friend, an old university acquaintance who worked at a wealth management firm in Mississauga. They had lunched twice during the period Desmond was watching. At the second lunch, Desmond's associate had been seated nearby. The conversation had been partially audible. Diane had been describing something she called the structure, a reference to Franklin's property, the estate, the value she was positioning herself to access. She had used the phrase, "once it's formalized." I sat in Desmond's office in Kitchener on a Thursday afternoon in February and read the written summary 3 times. Then I went back to Patricia Holt. My will had already been updated. My assets were structured through a trust that Franklin could benefit from under conditions that protected the principal. Patricia reviewed everything again in light of what Desmond had found. She added language. She made it tighter. She was thorough, and she didn't rush. And when I thanked her at the end of the meeting, she said that this was exactly what estate planning was for. March arrived. The wedding was on a Saturday, the 15th. A cold, pale day with thin clouds and a wind off Lake Erie that cut right through a dress coat. The venue was beautiful, I'll give her that. White flowers, good catering, a string quartet during the ceremony. Franklin looked like his mother's son, which is the best thing I can say about any moment. I sat in the front row. I had been told I was seated there. Diane's family occupied the other side. Her mother, a few cousins, a handful of friends. No father present, he had apparently been out of the picture for years. The ceremony went smoothly. Franklin said his vows in a steady voice. Diane said hers with a smile that reached her eyes. I watched carefully. I am not a sentimental man, but I felt the weight of the moment. My son was making the most important decision of his life, and I was the only person in that building who understood what he didn't know. During the cocktail hour, I found a quiet corner near the bar and checked my phone. Desmond had sent the final compiled report that morning, as we had arranged. It was thorough. It was documented. It was everything. Diane found me 20 minutes into the cocktail hour. She came alone, which I hadn't expected. She was holding a glass of Prosecco, and she was smiling, but her eyes were doing the calculation they always did. "Gordon," she said, "I'm so glad you're here." "Congratulations," I said. She leaned in slightly. "I want us to have a good relationship. Franklin needs that, and I think we got off on the wrong foot somewhere." I looked at her. "Did we?" "I think you have some concerns about me," she said, still smiling. "I understand that. You're his father. But I want you to know that I love your son, and I'm going to take care of him." I said, "I'm sure you plan to." Something shifted in her expression. Just for a moment, then she said quietly but clearly, "It might be better if you headed out after dinner. I don't want any tension tonight. This is our day." I took a sip of my drink. "Of course," I said. "I'll say my goodbyes." She walked away looking satisfied. I found Roger first. He was standing near the entrance with his wife. I told him it was time. He nodded once and patted my arm. Then I found Franklin. He was with a group of his friends near the windows, laughing at something. He looked happier than I had seen him in years, and for a moment I felt the full weight of what I was about to do. Not regret. I had no regrets about the truth. But grief, maybe, for the version of this night he deserved to have. I touched his arm and pulled him slightly aside. "I'm going to head out," I said. He frowned. "Already? Dad, it's barely 8 o'clock. "I know," I said. "Your wife suggested it might be for the best." He stared at me. "Before I go," I said, "I need you to have something." I handed him a sealed envelope. Inside was a printed summary, 1 page, plain language, with Desmond's contact information and Patricia's at the bottom. Not the full report. Not yet. Just enough. Read it when you're ready. Not tonight. When you're ready. He looked at the envelope, then at me. "Dad, what is this?" "It's information," I said. "You can decide what to do with it. That's always been your right." I hugged him. He held on longer than I expected. I walked out through the main doors into the cold March air. Roger and his wife came out behind me, and two other guests, old friends of mine from my working years, who had come at my invitation and who had agreed, if asked, to provide written accounts of what they had witnessed that evening regarding Diane's behavior and statements. I hadn't orchestrated a scene. I hadn't confronted anyone. I had simply been methodical, the way I had spent 40 years being methodical on job sites where a missed detail could cost a man his livelihood. I drove home and fed my dog and went to bed. Franklin called me 11 days later. He had read the summary the Monday after the wedding, he said. He hadn't believed it. He had put it away and tried not to think about it. Then, on the 9th day, he had been going through their joint account, the one they had opened the week before the wedding, and he noticed a transfer he didn't recognize. He had asked Diane about it. She had explained it away. He had looked more carefully. He asked me if he could see the full report. I drove to London that afternoon. We sat at his kitchen table, the same table he'd grown up eating breakfast at before his mother and I sold the family home, and I walked him through everything. Desmond's documentation. The previous relationships, the pattern, the conversation at the restaurant in Mississauga, the message on the phone. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" It's the question I had prepared for. The question I had asked myself 100 times driving back from Kitchener and London and Port Stanley. "Because you wouldn't have heard it," I said. "Not before you were ready. And I needed it to be complete before I handed it to you. Half a truth can be argued away. A full picture is harder to dismiss." He sat with that. "Patricia Holt wants to speak with you," I said. "There are legal steps available, given how recently the marriage was formalized. You have options." He nodded slowly. He was already somewhere else in his mind, reconstructing 14 months of memories, measuring them against a new set of facts. We didn't talk much after that. I made coffee. He sat at the table. At some point, the afternoon light shifted, and we both noticed it, and neither of us mentioned it. Before I left, he walked me to my truck. It was a clear evening, cold, the sky just starting to go orange in the west. "She told you to leave the wedding," he said. "It wasn't a question." "She did," I said. He shook his head slowly. "And you just went." "I left," I said. "But I didn't leave you." He stood there for a moment. Then he put his arms around me the way he used to when he was small and something had frightened him, and I held on and didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. The marriage was annulled 4 months later, on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation. Patricia Holt was thorough, as she always was. Franklin's property remained his. The joint line of credit was unwound, most of it, anyway. There were costs. There always are. Diane Ashworth did not contest it. I suspect her legal counsel advised her that a contested proceeding would surface documentation she preferred to keep buried. Franklin lives in his condo. He's taken up running, which I consider an unreasonable hobby, but have kept that opinion to myself. He comes to Lambeth for dinner on Sunday evenings when the drive is manageable, and we watch the game and argue about the Leafs the way we've done since he was 10 years old. He asked me once, a few months after everything had settled, whether I had always suspected her, or whether I had been looking for reasons to find fault. I thought about that honestly. "I didn't like the feeling I had," I said. "I didn't know if the feeling was right, so I found out." He nodded. "And if you'd been wrong?" "Then I'd have been wrong," I said. "And you'd have been married to someone who loved you, and we'd have had an uncomfortable conversation, and eventually it would have been fine." He thought about that. "That's a lot of trust in your own instincts." "I'm 64 years old," I said. "I've earned a few of them." He laughed. It was his mother's laugh, the one that starts in his chest. I've never told him that. Some things you keep. The lake froze late that year. I got one more fishing trip in before Christmas, just barely, out on Lake Huron with Roger and a thermos of coffee that was mostly whiskey by the second hour. We didn't catch much. The drive home was long and dark and quiet. I thought about Franklin the whole way. I thought about the Tuesday morning in October when he'd stood on my porch with his Tim Hortons coffee, working up to something. I thought about how close it had come to going differently, how easily a man can walk into something because he wants so badly for it to be good. And I thought about Margaret, how she'd trusted completely and trusted fast, and how I had spent 40 years trying to be worthy of it. I hope I'm still trying.